Rain fell over Seoul the way it always did before Kim Ji-ho made someone disappear. It came down in sheets that turned the streetlights into smeared gold coins on the asphalt, hammering the roofs of 3 black SUVs cutting through Mapogu at a speed no traffic camera would ever report. He sat in the back of the second vehicle, hands still, eyes closed, listening to the rain. 8 years he had waited for this address, 8 years of false leads and silence so total it felt engineered. Tonight the silence had finally cracked. A name. A warehouse near the old shipping docks. A location tied to Han Min-jae, the man who used to finish his sentences before he finished them himself. Ji-ho opened his eyes when the cars stopped. Boss. The lieutenant beside him, a broad man named Tae-sung with a scar dragging from his ear to his collarbone, didn't wait for permission to speak. This could be nothing. It's not nothing, Ji-ho said. His voice never rose. He wouldn't hide something this well unless it mattered. He stepped out into the rain without an umbrella, and none of his men reached for one either. The warehouse looked abandoned from the outside, rusted shutters, a chain-link fence with a hole cut through it just wide enough for a man to slip through sideways. But Ji-ho had learned long ago that the most dangerous places were the ones built to look empty. He gave one nod. 12 men moved before the nod finished. The doors came apart under a battering ram, and the warehouse interior lit up with muzzle flashes. Glass exploded from a mezzanine window above. Smoke rolled low across the concrete floor, curling around crates stamped with shipping codes. Ji-ho walked through the middle of it like a man strolling through a garden. He wasn't reckless. He had simply stopped being afraid of dying a long time ago. Somewhere around the same year he stopped being afraid of anything else. A man lunged at him from behind a stack of pallets with a knife raised high. Ji-ho caught the man's wrist mid-swing, turned it against its own joint until something popped wetly and let him drop. "Where is he?" Ji-ho said, and it wasn't a question, it was a demand wrapped in something almost gentle. The man, gasping, pointed toward a door marked with faded Hangul that once said maintenance. Ji-ho was already moving before he finished pointing. He reached the back office in time to see Han Min-jae's shadow slip through a gap in the floor, a hatch leading down into what used to be a drainage tunnel from the old dockyard days. Ji-ho ran to the hatch and stared into darkness that swallowed the sound of retreating footsteps. "Close it off," he said to Tae-sung, catching up behind him, breathing hard. Every exit within 2 kilometers. But they both already knew. By the time they reached the other end of that tunnel, Han Min-jae would be gone again, the way he'd been gone for 8 years, always one step ahead. Ji-ho stood over the hatch for a long moment, rain dripping from his hair onto the concrete below, and said nothing at all. That was when Tae-sung's radio crackled. "Storage room, west corner. We found something." Something in that world usually meant a body, a ledger, or a hostage. Ji-ho walked toward the storage room, already braced for any of the three. What he found was a child. The boy sat pressed into the corner behind a stack of crates, knees pulled to his chest, dark eyes wide but dry, watching the door with an alertness 7-year-olds weren't supposed to have. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just watched the way a much older person watches a threat they've already decided not to run from because running never worked before. Tae-sung crouched a few feet away, hands open, palms out. It wasn't working. The boy's eyes had already moved past him and fixed on the man standing in the doorway behind. "Boss," Tae-sung said quietly, not turning around. "What do we do?" Ji-ho looked at the boy. Something in his chest, some old room he'd sealed off years ago, creaked open half an inch. "Bring him," Ji-ho said. Nobody in that warehouse understood why the most feared man in the country wanted a stranger's child brought back to his mansion, but nobody asked. That wasn't how things worked with Kim Ji-ho. The drive back was silent except for the wipers. The boy sat across from Ji-ho, a blanket draped over his shoulders, small hands folded in his lap like he was waiting for a meeting to start rather than recovering from a firefight. Ji-ho studied him without hiding it. The boy's features carried something familiar in the shape of the jaw. "What's your name?" Ji-ho asked in English, testing something. "Ji-woo," the boy answered, also in English without hesitation, then added in flawless Korean, "But Amma calls me Woo when she's tired." Ji-ho's jaw tightened at the word Amma. "Mother." He said nothing else for the rest of the drive. If you're new here, this is Unscripted K, where we tell the stories that stay with you long after the credits roll. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from tonight. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe because what happens in the next few minutes is going to break something open in this story that nobody saw coming. The mansion swallowed sound the way old money always does. Marble floors, high ceilings, a silence so complete you could hear your own heartbeat in the hallways. Jiho's men expected the boy to finally break down once the adrenaline wore off and the reality of a gun battle caught up to a 7-year-old's nervous system. Kwon Dae-hyun was already waiting in the entryway when they arrived, standing exactly where he always stood when Jiho came home from something dangerous. He was older than Jiho by a decade, silver threading through his hair, dressed like a man who ran a legitimate holding company instead of the financial architecture behind one of the country's most feared organizations. He had been at Jiho's side for 11 years and there was no one, save perhaps Taesung, who Jiho trusted more completely. "You're bleeding," Dae-hyun said, crossing the marble floor, eyes already moving over Jiho for damage, quick and thorough. "Min-jae again." "He got out through the tunnels," Jiho said, and something in his voice made Dae-hyun's expression soften. 8 years and he still runs like a coward. Dae-hyun's gaze shifted to the boy standing near Taesung, small and still damp from the rain. "And who is this?" "We don't know yet," Jiho said. Dae-hyun studied the child a moment longer than seemed necessary, something unreadable crossing his face before it smoothed back into concern. "I'll have Dr. On brought in tonight. Whatever he needs. And I'll get a room prepared." He placed a hand briefly on Jiho's shoulder. "Get some rest. I'll handle the rest." Jiho nodded once, grateful in a way he didn't say out loud and thought nothing else of it. Jiwoo walked into the main sitting room, looked around at the dark wood and low lighting, and turned to look at Jiho with something that resembled curiosity more than fear. He studied Jiho's face for a long moment, the line of his brow, the set of his mouth, the way his eyes stayed still even when everything around him moved. Then the boy smiled, small and certain, the way children smile when a puzzle finally clicks into place. "Dad." The word landed in the room like something dropped from a great height. Taesung went completely still. 2 other men exchanged a look, neither tried to hide. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked, the loudest sound anyone had heard all night. Jiho didn't move for several seconds. Then slowly he lowered himself to one knee, bringing their eyes level, something he had never done for anyone in that house. "Who told you to call me that?" he asked, and for the first time in longer than anyone could remember his voice wasn't steady. Jiwoo tilted his head slightly as if the answer were obvious. "Why, Mom?" Nobody in that room breathed. Jiho simply stayed on one knee, trying to understand how a word that small could take apart 8 years of carefully built numbness in under 4 seconds. Later that night, after the estate's doctor confirmed the boy had no injuries beyond exhaustion, Jiho sat across from him in the study, a room lined with books nobody had time to read and a fireplace that hadn't been lit in years. "Tell me about your mother," Jiho said. He kept his tone level, but his hands, folded on the desk, were not as still as he wanted them to be. Jiwoo reached into a small backpack recovered from the warehouse and pulled out a photograph, its edges soft and rounded from years of handling, the kind of wear that only comes from being touched every single day. "She always kept this," the boy said. "Every time we moved to a new house she packed it before anything else. Before food. Before my clothes. She said if we ever got separated I had to find this man." Jiho took the photograph like it might dissolve if he moved too fast. It was him. Younger, softer around the eyes, standing beside a woman whose smile filled the entire frame. He hadn't allowed himself to think her name in 8 years, because thinking it meant remembering and remembering meant admitting she was gone. "This is a trick," Jiho said quietly. "Someone is using you." Jiwoo reached over and tugged the collar of Jiho's shirt to the side, exposing the old scar on his shoulder. "Mom said you got that saving her," the boy said. "She said a man tried to hurt her at a market once and you stepped in front of the knife instead of her." Jiho's hand rose to his own shoulder without his permission, fingers finding the scar like he needed to confirm it was real. Nobody outside of Jessica had ever known that story. Yet here was a child reciting it back to him like a bedtime story. "Who else did she tell that story to?" Jiho asked. "Nobody," Fu said. "Just me. She said it was our secret. Hers, mine and yours." Dae-hyun found Jiho alone in the study an hour later, the photograph still on the desk. "Taesung told me about the photograph." Dae-hyun picked it up, studying it under the lamplight. "This can't be real, Jiho. Someone wants you unstable." "I know how it looks," Ji-ho said quietly. Then let me carry some of this. Dae-hyun pulled a chair closer. I'll personally oversee whatever you need investigated. You don't have to do this one alone. It was the same voice that had gotten Ji-ho through the first unbearable year after Jessica vanished, and Ji-ho leaned on it now the same way he had then. Later, while the boy unpacked the rest of his small bag under a housekeeper's watch, something slipped from a side pocket and hit the hardwood floor with a small metallic click. Ji-ho crossed the room before he'd consciously decided to move. A silver bracelet. Thin, delicate, engraved along the inside with a line of text worn nearly smooth by years against skin. His hands weren't steady when he picked it up. He had given her this bracelet the night he proposed, in a garden behind a restaurant that didn't exist anymore. He had watched it disappear from the world along with her, the night everyone told him to accept she was dead. He hadn't let the world believe the truth. He had searched for 3 years before his own men convinced him the search was destroying him faster than any bullet could. He remembered sitting on the floor of a small apartment in Itaewon, Jessica's head resting against his shoulder, city lights bleeding gold through the window behind them. "Sing it again," she'd said, laughing, nudging him with her elbow. "You're the only person I've ever met who can't carry a tune and still somehow makes it sound beautiful." "That's because you're not listening to the notes," he told her. "You're listening to what it means." He'd hummed the melody again, something his grandmother used to sing to him before she passed. "One day," he'd said, brushing a curl back from her face, "you'll sing this to our children." She had smiled at that, the kind of smile that made a promise feel like it was already true. Now, with a bracelet in his hand and a boy down the hall who hummed in his sleep, Ji-ho understood that promise had come true in a way he never had the chance to witness. It happened close to midnight. The mansion had gone quiet. Ji-ho couldn't sleep and found himself walking the upstairs hallway without any particular destination in mind. That was when he heard it, a soft melody drifting from the guest room where Ji-woo had been settled for the night. Ji-ho stopped outside the door, listening to a 7-year-old hum the exact lullaby he had sung to Jessica a decade ago, note for note, a tune he had never once written down or recorded anywhere. He pushed the door open. Ji-woo sat cross-legged on the bed in the dark, humming to himself. "Who taught you that?" Ji-ho asked. Ji-woo looked up, smiled the same easy smile from earlier. "Hi, Mom." Then quieter, she said, "My dad taught it to her, and one day she'd teach it to me so I'd never forget what he sounded like even if I never got to meet him." Ji-ho didn't sleep at all that night. By morning he made a decision that surprised even himself. He would stop reacting and investigate this the way he investigated everything that threatened to break him, with cold, exact precision. He called in 6 of his most trusted men and gave them a single directive: find every property, every storage locker, every abandoned safe house connected to Han Min-jae in the last 8 years. Dae-hyun volunteered to coordinate the search himself. "You shouldn't be the one making calls to informants right now," he said. "Let me handle the moving pieces." When 2 of the men wanted to widen the search to old shipping manifests Dae-hyun had once helped structure, he gently steered them back toward Min-jae's known associates, reasoning that a broader search would take months they didn't have. It took 9 days. What they found unsettled even men who had long stopped being unsettled by anything. A network of properties scattered across the country, rural farmhouses, a rented unit outside Daegu, an apartment in Busan registered under a name that led nowhere real. Blackout curtains. Bolted windows. Bank records showed regular cash withdrawals timed to avoid pattern recognition. The breakthrough came from the warehouse itself, but not from anything left lying on a desk. Ji-ho's forensic team recovered several encrypted phones abandoned during the raid, along with the GPS system from one of the vehicles that had escaped before the police cordon closed in. Piece by piece, technicians reconstructed the final 24 hours before the assault. The messages revealed repeated references to the package being delayed until a new location was ready. The GPS records matched a route from a remote farmhouse outside Chuncheon to the warehouse, ending only hours before Ji-ho's men stormed the building. Security footage confirmed a single child had been brought into the warehouse that evening but had never been taken back out. It wasn't difficult to understand what had happened. The boy hadn't been abandoned there. He had been in the middle of a transfer. Someone had decided he could no longer remain where he had spent most of his life, and arrangements had already been made to move him somewhere even more secure. Ji-ho's raid had interrupted that relocation before it could be completed. He hadn't rescued the boy by chance. He had crashed headfirst into a plan already in motion, arriving at the exact moment it began to fall apart. The photograph. The scar. The bracelet. The lullaby. Each one alone could be explained away as manipulation. But together they built something that felt less like a trap and more like a truth Jiho was afraid to accept. He ordered a DNA test that same night, telling himself it was simply due diligence. The results came back 3 days later. Dae-hyun brought the envelope in himself, sitting across from Jiho instead of leaving him to open it alone, the way he had sat with him through every other unbearable piece of paper over the years. Jiho held the paper for nearly 20 minutes before he could make himself read the number twice. 99.98%. The boy was his son. He had faced down rival gangs, corrupt officials, and men who wanted him dead in more inventive ways than he cared to remember, and none of it had ever made his hands shake the way that single sheet of paper did. Somewhere out there his son, conceived in the last weeks of freedom either of them would know for a long time, had spent his whole life learning to survive without a father who was very much alive. And Jessica had spent 8 years being kept from the truth by someone who wanted him broken. To understand what came next, you have to understand what Jessica endured during those 8 years. She had been taken on an ordinary evening, walking home from the market with groceries she never got to unpack, only weeks after a night in Itaewon that neither of them yet knew had already changed everything. She remembered a cloth pressed to her face, then waking in a room with no windows, no clock, no sound from the outside world. For the first few weeks she fought every day, memorizing the guards' routines, testing every lock. Every attempt ended the same way, watched more closely than before. Then the sickness started, a fatigue sleep never touched. Her captors, unwilling to risk losing whatever she was worth to them, brought in a doctor who never met her eyes and never gave his name. He confirmed what she'd already suspected. She was pregnant, likely 5 or 6 weeks along, meaning she'd been carrying the child before she was ever taken, before Jiho had any way of knowing. She sat on the edge of that bed after he left, one hand pressed against her own stomach, and understood, with a clarity that terrified her, that surviving was no longer only about herself. Jiho had no idea he was about to become a father, and she was the only person left who could make sure that child ever got the chance to meet him. She was never told who orchestrated her captivity. What she was told over years was that Jiho had moved on, built a new life, and that hoping for rescue was a waste of the only thing she had left, her sanity. She never fully believed it. Some stubborn corner of her held on to the man who taught her a lullaby on the floor of a small apartment in Itaewon. But 8 years of isolation wears down even the strongest belief, thread by thread, until what's left isn't disbelief exactly, just an exhaustion too heavy to keep fighting against. She raised her son to remember his father anyway. She taught him the lullaby, kept the photograph, told him over and over, if we're ever separated, find this man. In the last year Jiwoo had grown harder to hide. He asked questions now a 7-year-old never would have, noticed patterns in the guards, remembered faces. Days before the raid they came for him without warning, telling her only that he'd be moved somewhere secure for a while. A separation she was given no choice in and no location for. She hadn't known where they were taking him. She hadn't known that somewhere across the city, in a warehouse she'd never see, her son was about to be found by the one man who'd spent 8 years believing she was dead. While Jiho pieced together the shape of Jessica's captivity, he was also closing in on why any of this had happened at all. As Jiho looked back on everything they had been through, a painful explanation began to take shape. Han Min-jae had not started as an enemy. Before the betrayals and the bloodshed, he had been the person Jiho trusted most, the man who helped build the organization from the ground up. They had fought side by side for years, surviving battles that should have killed them both. Somewhere along the way that loyalty began to rot. Min-jae watched Jiho become the man everyone followed without question. Every victory seemed to belong to Jiho. Every difficult decision ended with the same outcome. Jiho was praised, while Min-jae remained the man standing just behind him. The resentment didn't appear overnight. It grew quietly, fed by years of believing his sacrifices had been forgotten and that the life Jiho was living should have been his instead. Jessica became the final breaking point. Watching her choose Jiho over everything else convinced Min-jae that fate had stolen the last thing he believed he deserved. His revenge was never meant to be quick. Killing Jiho would have been too easy. He wanted Jiho to live with an emptiness that could never be filled, searching for answers that would always seem just beyond his reach. At least that was the story Min-jae believed. Only much later would Ji-ho discover that someone had been quietly feeding Min-jae's bitterness for years, nudging his anger in exactly the direction it needed to go. By then the damage had already been done. He hadn't expected the boy would ever find his way back. With the DNA results confirmed and the hidden properties mapped, Ji-ho stopped operating on instinct and started operating like the strategist he had always been underneath the rage. He assembled his most trusted circle in the war room, maps spread across the table marked with every known location, every access road, every extraction point. Dae-hyun stood near the head of the table, occasionally suggesting which route to avoid, which safe house to hit first, always reasonable, always exactly helpful. "We move once," Ji-ho said, his voice carrying the particular calm that made grown men straighten their spines. "We move correctly. No mistakes. If she's still alive, I will not lose her to a rushed decision." They planned for 11 days. Surveillance routes, backup extraction points, redundant communication channels. Before we get to what happens next, if you're enjoying this story so far, let us know in the comments where you're tuned in from tonight. We read every single one of them and it means more than you know. If you haven't hit subscribe yet, now's the time because everything is about to change. 3 days before the planned rescue, the first raid on a safe house outside Daegu came back empty. Recently emptied, furniture still warm, food left half-eaten. Whoever had been there left minutes before Ji-ho's men arrived. He dismissed it as bad timing until the second location 3 days later came back the same way. By the fourth failed raid, Ji-ho stood staring at a map that should have led him to Jessica and instead led him to the ghosts of a hurried departure, and understood, with a coldness that settled into his chest like ice water, that someone inside his own organization was warning them before every move. Suspicion spread through the estate like smoke through a closed room. It was Tae-sung, going through years of financial records with a vetted accountant, who found the pattern that broke everything open. Small transfers, untraceable through any single account, but consistent over 8 years, routed through channels only someone deep inside the organization's financial structure could have designed. The same channels Dae-hyun had built himself. The trail led to a name that made Tae-sung sit back and stare at the screen for a long time before he could make himself walk it upstairs. Not Han Min-jae. Kwon Dae-hyun. Suddenly every gentle redirection made sense. The quiet suggestion to search Min-jae's known associates instead of the wider shipping manifests. The offer to run point on logistics. The private calls always dismissed as some supplier issue. None of it had looked like anything because Dae-hyun had spent 11 years making sure nothing he did ever looked like anything. The man who had sat beside Ji-ho in the darkest weeks after Jessica's disappearance, who had rebuilt the empire alongside him brick by brick, had orchestrated the entire 8 years himself. Han Min-jae had simply been a tool, manipulated into believing his own grievance was the center of the plan when in truth he was only ever a distraction. A face for Ji-ho to hate while the Real architect stood beside him every single day. The motive was almost too simple to be believable. Years earlier, Dae-hyun had lost everything, his family, his standing, his future, in a deal Ji-ho had outmaneuvered him on without ever knowing the cost. Dae-hyun had smiled through 11 years of loyalty while quietly deciding that if he couldn't have what Ji-ho built, he'd make sure Ji-ho never got to keep it either. Even Min-jae hadn't known he was a puppet. Learning this shattered something in Ji-ho that even 8 years of grief hadn't touched. The realization that the comfort he leaned on in his lowest moment had been engineered by the same hand that caused it. Tae-sung stood beside him when he read the final report, saying nothing, needing to say nothing. He had never once given Ji-ho a reason to doubt him in 15 years. When Ji-ho looked up, Tae-sung was already reaching for his jacket. "Tell me where," Tae-sung said. "I'm coming with you." There was no more planning after that. There was only war. It began at the docks, where Dae-hyun's private shipment yard sat behind 3 layers of security that meant nothing once Ji-ho's men breached the outer gate in under 4 minutes. It moved into a luxury penthouse downtown where Min-jae, cornered and finally understanding the scale of his own manipulation, fought with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose. Knives. Gunfire. A stairwell fight that ended 2 floors lower than it started. Every victory came with a cost. Ji-ho found Dae-hyun in an underground tunnel beneath the shipyard, the same kind of tunnel Min-jae had disappeared into 8 years and a lifetime ago. Dae-hyun didn't run. He simply stood there, almost relieved, as if being caught was its own kind of ending he had been waiting for. You would have destroyed yourself eventually, Dae-hyun said quietly. I just made sure I got to watch. Ji-ho didn't answer him with words. What happened in that tunnel stayed there, and when Ji-ho walked out alone, his men understood without asking that the man who had haunted their operation for 8 years would not be haunting anyone again. They found Jessica 4 hours later in the last safe house on Dae-hyun's list, the farmhouse outside Chuncheon that had somehow escaped the pattern of hurried evacuations, because the leak had finally been sealed. Ji-ho walked through the front door first, against every protocol his own men would have insisted on for anyone else. She was sitting by a window, thinner than he remembered, her eyes carrying 8 years he could never fully understand. She looked up when the door opened and didn't move at all, like her mind refused to trust what her eyes showed her. Jessica, he said, and it came out cracked, nothing like the voice his enemies feared. She stood slowly, studying his face the way a person studies something they've been told repeatedly wasn't real. Neither said anything for a long moment. Everything that 8 years had stolen from them sat in the space between their eyes, and somehow, it didn't need translation. Jiwoo walked in behind Taesung, having insisted on being there when they found her. He crossed the room and took his mother's hand, then reached out and took Ji-ho's, standing between them like the missing piece that had found its own way home before either adult could. Jessica looked down at her son, then up at Ji-ho, and something in her chest, some door she had sealed shut to survive, finally cracked open. Softly she began to hum. Then a moment later to sing. The same lullaby. The exact melody Ji-ho had taught her on the floor of a small apartment a decade ago. The one he promised she'd sing to their children someday. Ji-ho stood completely still, listening to her voice carry a promise he had made and never gotten the chance to watch come true, until this exact moment, with his son's hand in his and the woman he never stopped loving finally in front of him again. Min-jae was gone. Dae-hyun had fallen. But for the first time in 8 years, the empire wasn't the only thing left standing in his life. The man his enemies believed had no heart left finally broke down, right there in that farmhouse, tears falling freely down a face that had forgotten how, not because he had won a war that cost him nearly everything, but because he had gotten back the only thing he had ever actually wanted. His family. Found against every possible odds, exactly where love had quietly been keeping them safe the entire time. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. We poured everything into this one, and if it moved you even half as much as it moved us while writing it, let us know which twist caught you most off guard, the advisor, the lullaby, or something else entirely. Drop it in the comments, tap that like button if you enjoyed the ride, and subscribe to Unscripted K so you never miss the next Afro-Korean story we bring to life. We'll see you in the next one.